Florida, 1983. The town of Brooksville was quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, and everyone knew everyone else's business. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, something unthinkable happened. Mary Ann Porter, a vibrant 21-year-old college student with a future full of promise, stepped out of her friend's house. Her laughter echoed in the cool summer air as she made her way home, completely unaware that the final moments of her life had already begun. By the time the clock struck midnight, Mary Ann had vanished. The town was gripped by fear. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. One moment she was there and the next she was gone. A frantic search ensued, but as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, the town began to fear the worst. They were searching for a ghost. For months, the town streets felt empty without Mary Ann. Her disappearance had left a hole that no one could fill. Her mother, Evelyn, clung to the hope that her daughter would return, but each passing day only deepened the fear. The investigation seemed promising at first. There were witness reports, some claiming to have seen a car near the park that night. Others had heard strange noises from the woods behind Mary Ann's apartment. But no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no sign of struggle, was found. It was as if the night had swallowed her whole. Then, months later, a gruesome discovery would bring the community face to face with a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. But even with this new evidence, the question remained, who could have done this? And why? Brooksville was never the same after that night. And neither were the people who had once lived in peace, blissfully unaware that sometimes evil hides behind the most familiar faces. Mary Ann Porter wasn't just a victim, she was the heart of her community. Known for her kindness, her intelligence, and her warm smile, Mary Ann had a light that drew people to her. She was the daughter that every mother wished for, the student every teacher admired, and the friend who would drop everything to help someone in need. Raised by her mother, Evelyn, after her father passed away when Mary Ann was just a child, their bond was unshakable. Evelyn had worked tirelessly to give her daughter a life full of opportunity, despite their struggles. Mary Ann had dreams, big ones. She wanted to leave Brooksville and become a graphic designer, to explore the world outside of their small town. She had been accepted into college on a full scholarship, the first in her family to go to school beyond high school. Her future was bright, and the town of Brooksville had watched her grow into the ambitious young woman she was, full of promise and hope. The night she disappeared, Mary Ann had been walking home from her friend's house after a simple dinner. She was supposed to meet her mother later that evening for a quick chat, but she never showed up. The last conversation Evelyn had with her daughter was a brief, cheerful exchange over the phone earlier in the night. Mary Ann was only a few blocks away from home. The walk was short and familiar, one she had taken countless times before. But that night she never made it back. The search began almost immediately. Evelyn, frantic with worry, contacted the police as soon as she realized her daughter was missing. For days there was hope. Perhaps she had gotten lost or something had delayed her. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Evelyn's hope began to fade. The community rallied to support the search. Volunteers combed through the woods, sifted through abandoned buildings, and searched every corner of the town, but it was as if Mary Ann had simply vanished off the face of the earth. And then, after months of anguish, there was a breakthrough. A body was discovered deep in the woods behind Mary Ann's apartment. It was Mary Ann. But the discovery only led to more questions. How had she ended up there? What had happened to her? And most disturbingly, who had taken her? The police were no closer to finding the answers, and the town was left reeling in disbelief. The calm, peaceful streets of Brooksville had turned into a place of suspicion, fear, and unanswered questions. Everyone was a suspect and no one knew who to trust anymore. Evelyn's heart shattered as she stood before the body of her daughter. "What did I do wrong?" she whispered, clutching the picture of Mary Ann she had kept on her nightstand for years. In the weeks following Mary Ann's disappearance, the town of Brooksville was a hive of activity. The police, alongside volunteers from the community, scoured every inch of the town. Helicopters flew over the dense woods, and dogs were brought in to sniff for any sign of her whereabouts. But every lead turned up empty. The sheriff's office, though experienced with minor cases, was ill-equipped to handle a mystery of this scale. The case soon became a cold one. For a while, the town went on as if nothing had happened, though a lingering shadow loomed over them all. People returned to their routines, but the whispers never stopped. Detective Lisa Harris had just started her career at the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office when she was assigned to the case. She was fresh out of the academy, determined and eager to prove herself. She had grown up in Florida and was familiar with the quiet charm of small towns, but she was not prepared for the toll this case would take on her. Her first day on the job, she walked into the office with a stack of old files in her hands. The case was one of many unsolved cold cases piling up. But as soon as she read the file on Marion Porter, something about it stuck with her. The young woman's smile in the photograph, the way the town had reacted to her disappearance, it all felt too personal. She spent the first few days familiarizing herself with the case, reading through witness statements, examining photos of the crime scene, and talking to local officers. One thing became clear: there were no solid leads. The last person to see Marion was her friend, Lisa Montgomery, who claimed that Marion had left her house around 10:30 p.m., only minutes before she disappeared. But Lisa's statement was vague and inconclusive. The only other possible lead came from an anonymous caller who claimed to have seen a car parked near the woods that night. But there were no witnesses to back up the story. Detective Harris quickly realized that the investigation was stuck in a loop. There were no signs of struggle at the scene, no fingerprints, and no security footage to work with. Marion had vanished into thin air. The frustration was palpable in the sheriff's office. While the community continued to demand answers, the officers were overwhelmed by the lack of evidence. Then came the first breakthrough, if it could even be called that. A piece of fabric was found near the woods, the spot where Marianne's body had been discovered months later. It was a dark, shredded piece of cloth, small enough to be overlooked by anyone who wasn't looking carefully. Lisa Harris immediately sent it off for forensic analysis. Days later, the results came back, revealing traces of blood. This discovery gave the case a new edge. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next step was to dig deeper into the residents of Brooksville. They all knew each other, but sometimes that familiarity could be the hardest obstacle to break through. Detective Harris started by interviewing friends, family members, and the last people who had seen Marion alive. Her conversation with Lisa Montgomery, her best friend, was particularly telling. Lisa Montgomery was clearly distraught, but Harris noticed a slight hesitation when she was asked about the evening. There was a discomfort in her answers, an unease that Lisa couldn't quite hide. "I told her to be careful," Lisa said, her voice shaky. "She said she would be home in a few minutes. I didn't think anything of it," but there was something in her tone that made Detective Harris pause. It wasn't a direct lie, but it felt like there was more to the story. Lisa Montgomery wasn't the only one who seemed to be hiding something. Most of the townspeople, despite their outward concern, seemed to be avoiding certain topics. It was as if they didn't want to dig too deep into the past. The investigation seemed to hit a wall until one day, a name came up in conversation that stopped Detective Harris in her tracks: James Thompson. Thompson was well known in the community, a local mechanic who ran a small shop near the edge of town. He had been friendly with Marianne's mother, Evelyn, and had always been helpful to the residents. James was also present at several community events, and no one had ever suspected him of anything sinister. However, his name was mentioned in connection with the night of Marianne's disappearance. A few months before her vanishing, there had been a minor argument between James and Marianne at the local diner. The disagreement was over something trivial, an argument about a lost wallet that Marianne had supposedly found and returned to him. But that exchange was the first hint that something was off about James Thompson. Detective Harris dug deeper into his background. His record was spotless. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, paid his taxes on time, and had no criminal history. But Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. James was almost too perfect. A community man, never in trouble, always helping out. It seemed like a perfect facade. Then came the second clue. When James was interviewed, he claimed he hadn't seen Marianne on the night of her disappearance, but the timeline didn't quite match up. According to his neighbors, he had been in his shop around 11 p.m., but there was no one who could confirm it. No security footage, no one who had seen him during that time. It was an odd detail, but nothing that could directly tie him to the crime. Still, Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She visited his shop, a small, dimly lit space that smelled of oil and metal. His personal effects were scattered around the office, and Harris noticed a small, worn photograph on his desk. It was of Marianne taken at a town event, smiling as she stood beside James. There was no explanation for why he had kept it, especially given the tension that had surfaced between them. The next few days saw Harris questioning other locals, gathering more fragments of information. But for every step forward, she felt like she was being pulled back by the shadows of uncertainty. She began to sense that the answers were buried deep within the community's walls, hidden under layers of fear and denial. As the pressure mounted and time continued to pass, Harris was left with no clear answers, just more questions. Each interview revealed a new angle, a new piece of the puzzle. But with every lead she followed, the more she realized that this was not just a simple case of a missing person. It was a complex web of lies, secrets, and community trust that was now being tested. The only thing she knew for certain was that someone in Brooksville knew exactly what happened to Mary and Porter, and they weren't talking. Detective Lisa Harris spent the following weeks retracing every lead, but with each step forward, the case seemed to slip further out of her grasp. The town of Brooksville had turned into a place of whispers and fear, and the more she learned about its residents, the more she felt like the walls were closing in on her. Everyone seemed to have something to hide, and each new clue led her down another dead-end path. There were several leads that seemed promising at first, but each time Harris thought she was close to the truth, the case would take a sudden, confusing turn. One such lead came from an unexpected source: Tommy Phillips, a teenager who claimed to have seen a car parked on a deserted road near the woods the night Mary Ann disappeared. Tommy was known around town as a troublemaker, but his story seemed genuine enough. He insisted that the car's headlights were off, and he'd seen a shadowy figure moving near the vehicle. The detail was chilling, especially given that the woods where Mary Ann's body was found were nearby. But when Harris sent officers to search the area, no evidence was found. No car had been reported missing, and no traces of tires were left behind. It was as if Tommy's sighting was nothing more than a teenage fantasy. She questioned him again, but his story began to shift, the details slipping through his fingers like sand. "Maybe I was wrong," Tommy admitted reluctantly when Harris pressed him. "It could have been someone else, you know? Just forget I said anything." His credibility was quickly called into question. He wasn't a reliable witness, and the case returned to square one. With no hard evidence and every lead turning into a dead end, Harris turned back to the most reliable piece of the case: the evidence gathered from Mary Ann's body. Forensic reports revealed signs of struggle, which raised more questions. There was no sign of sexual assault, which seemed strange considering the circumstances. No defensive wounds either. Whoever took Mary Ann had been prepared and calculated, moving swiftly and efficiently. The autopsy results showed that Mary Ann had been alive for several days after her disappearance, but no one knew exactly how or why. She had been carefully placed in a concealed area deep in the woods, hidden from view. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, but there were no obvious signs of the killer's identity. However, there was one discovery that had eluded the investigation until now: a small, frayed piece of cloth, likely from a jacket or shirt, found near her body. It had been torn, possibly during a struggle. Harris immediately sent it for further forensic analysis. This time, the results came back with a small but important detail: a trace amount of James Thompson's DNA. At first, Harris didn't believe it. She had interviewed Thompson multiple times, and he had always maintained his innocence. But now, the evidence tied him to the scene in a way that was undeniable. His DNA was found on the fabric. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a potential breakthrough. The news of the DNA discovery sent shockwaves through Brooksville. Detective Harris had been suspicious of James Thompson from the beginning, but this new revelation was enough to push him to the forefront of the investigation. Thompson was brought in for questioning once more. His demeanor remained calm, almost too calm, as if he were completely unaffected by the mounting evidence. His alibi was airtight. He claimed to have been at his auto shop that night, working late on a client's car. But his story began to crack under the pressure of Harris's questions. "You're telling me you were alone that night?" Harris asked, watching him closely. Thompson nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Nobody else saw you?" she pressed. He hesitated. "No. I was alone." Harris continued to dig. "So, how do you explain your DNA being found at the crime scene?" James' expression remained unchanged, but his voice faltered. "I don't know. I've never been to those woods. I don't even know where she was found." Despite his calm demeanor, Harris could see the cracks in his story. But without concrete proof linking him directly to the murder, the DNA evidence alone wasn't enough to arrest him. She had to find more. As news of Thompson's connection to the case spread, the town was divided. Some residents still believed in his innocence. After all, he had been a pillar of the community for years. But others were convinced that he had been hiding something all along. Evelyn Porter, Mary Ann's mother, was caught in the middle of the controversy. She had always trusted James, and now she was faced with the painful reality that the man she had called a friend could be responsible for her daughter's death. Every time she looked at him, her heart twisted in disbelief. Could the man she had known for years truly be capable of such an awful crime? In the days following the DNA discovery, Detective Harris watched as the town of Brooksville seemed to fracture. Longtime friends turned against each other, neighbors avoided eye contact, and every conversation was laced with suspicion. It was as if the murder had uncovered something deeper in the town. Hidden secrets, old grudges, and fractured relationships that no one had ever wanted to face. But as Harris continued to question those closest to Thompson, she discovered something else. Something that made her rethink everything she thought she knew about him. James Thompson had a history that few knew about. He had been involved in a violent altercation years earlier, back when he lived in another town. The fight had been over money, a dispute that had escalated quickly, resulting in a police report and a brief stint in jail. But the incident had been swept under the rug, and Thompson had left town soon after, only to return years later to start his life again in Brooksville. Why had no one mentioned this before? Harris couldn't help but wonder if this past connection had something to do with Mary Ann's murder. Was it possible that his anger from years ago had resurfaced in a deadly way? Had he known something about Mary Ann, something that had made him snap? Or was it a coincidence? But with each new lead, the case seemed to spiral further into uncertainty. James Thompson wasn't the only suspect. There were others who had been close to Mary, and each of them with their own reasons to be questioned. As Harris continued her investigation, more false leads popped up. There was the local high school teacher, Mr. Harold Finch, who had been unusually nervous during his interview. He claimed to have known Mary Ann from when she was a student in his history class. But when Harris dug into his background, she found nothing of interest, except for an unexplained incident where he had been caught in a compromising position with a student at another school years earlier. But despite the suspicion, there was no hard evidence linking him to the crime. Next came the bartender, who claimed to have seen Mary Ann talking to a stranger at a local bar a week before she disappeared. The bartender had given conflicting accounts of the conversation, which made it clear that she was either lying or mistaken. With every new person she interviewed, the story grew murkier. False leads, conflicting statements, and old secrets created a web of confusion. Detective Harris felt like she was drowning in a sea of uncertainty, desperate for something solid to hold onto. The discovery of James Thompson's DNA on the fabric found near Mary Ann's body was a turning point in the investigation. Detective Lisa Harris couldn't ignore it. 4 days she had reviewed the evidence, questioned witnesses, and pieced together a case that seemed to be pointing in one direction: James Thompson. Despite his calm demeanor during questioning, there was something unsettling about his reaction to the news. He had been careful with his answers, choosing his words like a man who was trying to stay one step ahead. But the more Harris dug, the clearer it became that Thompson had a connection to the crime, one that went deeper than anyone had imagined. However, Harris knew that the evidence, as compelling as it was, wasn't enough to arrest him yet. The DNA found on the fabric could have been planted, or it could have been a coincidence. No matter how much she suspected him, no matter how much the town had started to turn against him, Harris knew that the law required more. They needed solid proof. The pressure was mounting. The case had captured the attention of not only the local community but also the media. Brooksville was no longer just a quiet town, it was now a place haunted by a murder mystery that had captivated the nation. Every newspaper, every TV station was covering the case, and the eyes of the world were on Harris. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. It was late one evening when Harris received a call that would change the course of the investigation. The forensic team had come through with another result: a match. The fabric, the DNA, and the tissue samples found at the crime scene all pointed to a match that no one had expected. The evidence was irrefutable now. It wasn't just a coincidence. James Thompson's involvement in Mary Ann's death was clear. With this final confirmation, Harris moved quickly. She couldn't wait any longer. She called in a team of officers to prepare for the search warrant. It was time to act. Thompson had to be arrested. As she and her team arrived at Thompson's auto shop, the sun had just begun to set. The town was peaceful, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Harris and her officers approached the small building, their footsteps muffled by the gravel road beneath their boots. The air was thick with anticipation, and a nervous tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Inside, James Thompson was working on a car, just as he had claimed he was doing the night Mary Ann had gone missing. When Harris and her team entered, he looked up with an expression of mild surprise. There was no panic, no fear, just an unreadable look that made Harris's stomach churn. He knew why they were here. "James Thompson," Harris said, her voice steady but firm, "you're under arrest for the murder of Mary Ann Porter." For a moment there was silence. Thompson stood motionless, his eyes narrowing as he processed the words. Then, as if nothing had changed, he slowly set down his wrench and raised his hands in surrender. I knew this day would come, he said softly, almost to himself. There was no attempt to deny it, no outrage, just a quiet acceptance that seemed almost rehearsed. I didn't mean to kill her. It just happened. As Thompson was handcuffed and led out of the auto shop, the streets of Brooksville remained eerily silent. The news would spread quickly, but for now, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Harris watched as Thompson was driven away, his face calm, almost resigned. It didn't make sense. He had always been the town's reliable mechanic, the man people trusted with their cars, their problems, and their lives. And yet, he was the one who had taken Mary Ann's life. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Word spread like wildfire, and by morning the streets were buzzing with whispers and disbelief. James Thompson, the man who had lived among them for years, was a killer. It was impossible to wrap their minds around it. Some people refused to believe it, claiming that Harris had made a mistake or that the evidence was fabricated. Others were quick to call for justice, demanding that Thompson pay for what he had done. Evelyn Porter, Mary Ann's mother, was torn. She had spent months hoping that her daughter's killer would be found, but now that it was over, she didn't know how to feel. Was this justice? Or was it just another cruel twist of fate? She stood in the doorway of her home, staring out at the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to discuss the arrest. Some had tears in their eyes, others were angry, but all of them shared the same disbelief. How could James Thompson, someone they had all known for years, be capable of such a crime? Evelyn could feel the weight of the community's gaze on her. They were looking to her for answers, but she didn't have any. All she could think about was Mary and her daughter, her baby, and the truth that had been buried for so long. Back at the police station, Thompson sat quietly in an interrogation room, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Detective Harris entered, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She stood across from him, watching him closely. "You want to tell me what happened?" Harris asked, her voice calm but piercing. Thompson looked up at her, his eyes empty. He took a long breath before speaking. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he said quietly. "I never meant for her to die. I couldn't stop. When I saw her that night, I couldn't control myself anymore. She was everything I wanted, everything I couldn't have. She didn't know how much I cared about her. She didn't understand how much I needed her." Harris listened in silence, her stomach churning at the rawness of his confession. She knew he was guilty, but hearing him speak with such coldness made her sick. There was no remorse in his voice, no recognition of the pain he had caused. Just an eerie sense of justification. "I didn't plan on killing her," Thompson continued, his voice shaking now. "But when she started to leave, when she started to walk away from me, I lost control. I couldn't let her go." Harris felt a chill run down her spine as she realized just how twisted Thompson's emotions were. He hadn't been a man pushed to the edge by circumstances. No, this was something deeper, something darker. "You will pay for what you've done," Harris said coldly, staring him down. Thompson's eyes lowered to the floor. "I know." As news of Thompson's confession spread through Brooksville, the community was left to process what had happened. The shock of his arrest turned into anger and sadness. People felt betrayed. The man they had trusted, the man they had known for years, was capable of something so horrific. But for Evelyn there was no peace. The justice she had longed for felt hollow. Mary Ann was never coming back. Her daughter was gone, and no arrest could bring her back. As the trial loomed on the horizon, the town of Brooksville was left in limbo, caught between disbelief and sorrow. The arrest had brought the truth to light, but at what cost? Detective Lisa Harris had been working tirelessly on the case, piecing together the evidence and digging into the personal lives of everyone connected to the murder. But it wasn't until she uncovered details of James Thompson's past that the full scope of the crime began to take shape. Thompson had always been a model citizen, well-liked, hardworking, and seemingly harmless. He ran his auto shop in Brooksville for over a decade, and no one had ever suspected that he might be capable of murder. But now Harris needed to understand what drove him to kill Mary Ann Porter. Harris started by revisiting Thompson's records. What she found was a history that had been hidden behind a veneer of normalcy. Thompson had lived in Gainesville before moving to Brooksville, and it was there that the first cracks in his facade had appeared. In Gainesville, Thompson had been involved in a violent altercation years ago, an incident that had almost been forgotten. Back then he was a different person, angrier, more volatile. He had been arrested for assault after an altercation with a man named Daniel Hayes over a debt. The fight had escalated quickly, resulting in Thompson breaking Daniel's jaw and leaving him with a permanent scar. Thompson had been jailed for a short time, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug when he moved to Brooksville. At the time, no one in Brooksville had any idea about his past. It was as if Thompson had wiped the slate clean. He started fresh, blending in with the locals, earning their trust and keeping his past buried. But as Harris dug deeper, she began to see patterns of behavior that mirrored his actions with Mary and control, obsession, and a propensity for violence when things didn't go his way. Thompson's history of aggression and control became clearer when Harris reviewed his relationship with Mary Ann. She discovered that Thompson had often tried to get close to her, even when it was clear she wasn't interested. He had been persistent, friendly to the point of discomfort, always finding ways to be near her, always helping her mother with odd jobs around the house. His obsession with Mary Ann, it seemed, had been building for months. He had become fixated on her, unable to understand why she hadn't returned his affections. As Harris continued her investigation, she realized that Thompson had used his friendly demeanor to cover his darker intentions. He had ingratiated himself into Mary Ann's life by being a helpful neighbor and a familiar face. His subtle manipulations were clever, making him appear trustworthy while keeping his true intentions hidden. The more Harris learned, the more she understood the dangerous game Thompson had been playing. He wasn't just a man obsessed with a young woman. He was someone who had spent years carefully crafting a persona to conceal his violent tendencies. He had used his charm to hide his true nature, and it was only through the investigation that his true character began to surface. The most chilling part of all was how Thompson had integrated himself into the fabric of Mary Ann's life. He was everywhere she went. He had access to her home, her family, and her mother's trust. He wasn't just a casual acquaintance. He was someone who had positioned himself as a constant presence, without anyone ever questioning his motives. In fact, Harris learned that Thompson had been at Mary Ann's home just days before her disappearance. Evelyn Porter had asked him to help fix a broken lawnmower, and it was on that visit that Mary Ann had become uncomfortable with his advances. She had mentioned it to her mother, but Evelyn dismissed it as nothing more than a misunderstanding. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, Harris knew that those comments were the first signs of something much darker. It was one small detail, one seemingly insignificant piece of evidence, that finally tied everything together. While going over old evidence once more, Harris discovered a receipt from Thompson's auto shop. The date on the receipt matched the night Mary Ann had disappeared, and it revealed something troubling. The receipt showed that Thompson had worked on a car for a client that evening. But the client's name was never listed, and there was no record of payment. The receipt had been deliberately left incomplete, and there was no explanation for why Thompson had not recorded the transaction. Harris immediately realized that Thompson had been lying about his whereabouts that night. The alibi he had provided was false. He hadn't been working at his shop as he had claimed. Instead, he had been in the woods waiting for Mary Ann. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a message found on Thompson's phone, a text message from a friend who had been in town for a short visit. The message was innocuous at first glance, but when Harris read it again with the knowledge she now had about Thompson's obsession with Mary Ann, it sent a chill down her spine. "Remember to keep your head clear tonight. Don't get too caught up in it. We don't need any mistakes." The message seemed harmless, but now, with everything else she had uncovered, Harris understood that it wasn't just a friendly reminder. It was a warning, a reminder to Thompson to keep his emotions in check as he stalked Mary Ann. The mistake referred to in the message was the very crime he had committed. With the weight of the evidence finally overwhelming her, Detective Harris knew it was time to make the arrest. Thompson's past, his obsession with Mary Ann, the lies he had told, everything pointed to him being the murderer. There were no more doubts in her mind. She put in the request for an arrest warrant, knowing that it was only a matter of time before James Thompson's secret life would be exposed to the world. He had lived among them for years, fooling everyone, but now the truth was about to come out. The arrest was set. But as Harris prepared for the final chapter of the investigation, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of unease. It wasn't just that Thompson had killed Mary Ann, it was that he had been hiding in plain sight all along, manipulating everyone around him. And now, after all the lies and the deception, it was finally time for him to face justice. It was an ordinary morning in Brooksville, or so it seemed. The sun was shining, and the streets were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of small-town life. People were going about their business, picking up groceries, grabbing coffee from the local cafe, and chatting with neighbors. But for Detective Lisa Harris, the calm before the storm felt like an eternity. The arrest warrant had been signed, and there was no turning back now. The evidence against James Thompson was overwhelming. His DNA, his lies, his obsession with Mary Ann, everything pointed to him as the killer. But Harris couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. There was something about the calmness of the town, the way everything seemed to be going on as usual, that unnerved her. The arrest of Thompson was going to shatter that calm forever. It would change everything. No one could imagine that the man they had trusted for years, James Thompson, the local mechanic, was capable of such a horrific crime. As Harris sat in her car outside Thompson's auto shop, she ran over the plan in her mind. The operation had to be executed with precision. She couldn't afford any mistakes. The last thing she needed was a confrontation that could escalate into violence. She had no idea what Thompson was capable of, but she knew he wasn't going to go down without a fight. It wasn't long before the call came in. Thompson was at his shop, just as he had been the night Marian disappeared. The time had come. The officers moved swiftly, parking their cars a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. Harris led the charge, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been this close to the final moment, the moment when the truth would be revealed, when justice would be served. As they approached Thompson's shop, Harris noticed the familiar sight of his weathered mechanic's uniform hanging on the door. The same uniform he had worn for years, always neatly pressed, always looking like the trustworthy, hard-working man he was known to be. But today that uniform took on a new meaning. Today it represented the lie, the deception that had been woven into the very fabric of this small town. Today it would be a symbol of the man who had concealed his true nature behind the mask of respectability. Harris pushed open the door to the shop, the jingle of the bell above the door barely audible over the sound of the engine running in the background. James Thompson was bent over the hood of a car, working as he had countless times before. He didn't look up when the officers entered. For a brief moment, Harris thought maybe he hadn't heard them, that he was oblivious to what was about to happen. But that wasn't the case. Thompson looked up slowly, his face still calm, almost too calm. His eyes met Harris's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, recognition maybe, or resignation. He didn't flinch, didn't show fear. He just stood there, wiping his hands on a rag as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "James Thompson," Harris said, her voice firm but steady. "You're under arrest for the murder of Marian Porter." Thompson didn't move. He didn't say a word. For a long, tense moment, there was only silence. Harris stood across from him, watching him closely, trying to read his expression. Was he guilty? Did he feel any remorse? Or was he just a man who had committed a crime and now accepted the consequences? Then finally Thompson spoke. His voice was low, almost too calm. "I knew this day would come," he said. His tone wasn't one of fear or surprise, but of quiet acceptance. "I didn't mean to kill her, you know. It just happened." Harris felt a cold chill crawl up her spine as she processed his words. Did he honestly think that was an explanation? That was no apology, no confession, just a rationalization. Thompson made no attempt to resist as the officers moved in to cuff him. His hands, once steady as he worked on cars, now seemed strangely limp, as though the fight had left him long ago. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Thompson didn't even look at Harris. He kept his gaze on the ground, his expression unreadable. "Let's go," one of the officers said, motioning for Thompson to move. Harris followed as Thompson was led out of the shop, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building. The world outside seemed oblivious to the momentous event that had just unfolded. The streets of Brooksville remained unchanged. People were still going about their day, unaware that one of their own had just been taken away in handcuffs. Harris watched as Thompson was placed into the back of the police car. The town would never be the same. The arrest had rocked their sense of security, their trust in the people around them. James Thompson was no longer the trusted mechanic. They now had to face the reality that he was a murderer, a man who had lived a lie for years. As news of Thompson's arrest spread through Brooksville, the town erupted into chaos. The once peaceful streets were now filled with anxious whispers, stunned faces, and uncertain glances. People gathered in small groups, discussing the arrest in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Some were in disbelief. Sarah Mitchell, a longtime friend of Thompson's, stood in front of her home, her eyes wide with shock. "I can't believe it," she muttered. "He was like family. He didn't do it. He couldn't have." Her voice trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. This isn't the James the first knew. Others were more accepting of the truth, their anger simmering beneath the surface. John Davidson, a local farmer who had always been suspicious of Thompson, didn't hesitate to speak his mind. "I knew something was off about him," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "That man was hiding something, and now we all know what it was." But it wasn't just the community that was affected. Evelyn Porter, Marianne's mother, was left reeling. She had waited for this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, it felt like nothing had changed. Her daughter was still gone. No amount of justice could bring her back. She stood alone in her living room, staring at the empty chair where Marian used to sit. The room felt cold and distant, the silence deafening. She didn't know whether to feel relief or more sorrow. For years she had prayed for this moment, but now that it had come, she couldn't bring herself to smile. Her daughter's killer had been caught, but at what cost? The arrest was just the beginning. The media descended on Brooksville like vultures, eager for every detail of the case. Harris knew that the real work was just beginning. The trial, the questioning, the painful memories that would resurface for the community. And there was still one question hanging over everyone's heads. Why? Why had Thompson done it? What had driven him to kill Mary Ann, the young woman who had been so full of life and promise? Harris didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew that the truth would come out. It always did. The town was in shock, but it was also coming to terms with the harsh reality that even the most trusted members of a community can harbor dark secrets. Brooksville would never be the same, and neither would the people who lived there. As Thompson was driven away, Harris stood in the street, watching the police car disappear down the road. She couldn't help but wonder what had been going through his mind as he was arrested. Was he sorry? Was he relieved that it was over? Or had he simply accepted his fate? One thing was for certain. The arrest of James Thompson was only the beginning of a much larger journey for the people of Brooksville, a journey that would force them to confront the darkness hidden in their midst. The days following James Thompson's arrest were a whirlwind of activity, but also a time of unsettling quiet. The streets of Brooksville had fallen into a strange silence, as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the final resolution of the case. The news outlets flooded the town with updates, but it was the quiet conversations in kitchens and living rooms behind closed doors that told the true story. Detective Lisa Harris, though, had no time to dwell on the town's reaction. She had work to do. The arrest of Thompson was only the beginning. Now came the task of uncovering why he had committed the crime, why Mary Ann had been his victim, and how deep his obsession with her truly ran. For Harris, the most pressing question was not just how Thompson had done it, but why. The crime itself was brutal, calculated, and committed by someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years. The town's facade of safety and trust had been shattered, and now Harris was determined to get to the root of Thompson's actions. Back in the interrogation room, Thompson was still eerily calm. After his arrest, he had been taken in for questioning again. His first confession had been chilling in its casual tone. "I didn't mean to kill her," he had said. But now Harris needed to dig deeper. She knew that his initial confession was just the surface. He had confessed, but he hadn't yet revealed the full truth. Sitting across from him once more, Harris placed the file on the table in front of her. Thompson barely glanced at it. His demeanor was unchanged from before, distant, emotionless, almost resigned. "James, you've confessed to the crime," Harris began, her voice steady but probing. "But you haven't told me why. You haven't told me why Mary Ann. Why did you choose her?" Thompson's eyes flickered for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "She didn't understand," he said slowly. "She never saw me for who I really was. I tried, I helped her. I did everything I could. But she just pushed me away. I thought, if she knew how much I cared about her, if she knew how much I wanted her in my life, maybe she'd stop looking at me like I was just a friendly neighbor." Harris listened carefully, taking in his words. His obsession with Mary Ann had been brewing for a long time, she now realized. It wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. Thompson had spent months, maybe even years, nurturing an unhealthy fixation on Mary Ann, hoping that one day she would come to see him as more than just the town mechanic. There was no one else. No one who understood me the way she did. And when she started to pull away, when she began to ignore me, it felt like I was losing everything," he continued. "I thought, if I could just get her to see me, just get her to understand how much I cared, then maybe everything would be okay. But she didn't understand, and she never would." The coldness in his voice, the complete lack of remorse, was chilling. Harris had worked on many cases, but this one felt different. Thompson wasn't just a murderer. He was someone who had spent years building up a fantasy in his mind, and when reality didn't meet his expectations, he snapped. Harris knew that Thompson's obsession with Mary Ann wasn't just a case of unrequited love. There were deeper psychological issues at play, issues that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. Thompson had shown signs of obsessive behavior, but Harris had to delve further into his past to understand the root cause of his actions. She reached out to a forensic psychologist, Dr. Linda Michaels, who specialized in criminal behavior and obsessional disorders. Dr. Michaels agreed to review Thompson's case, and what she uncovered only added to the complexity of the crime. He's a textbook case of obsessive love disorder, combined with elements of narcissism and control issues, Dr. Michaels explained after reviewing the case. He believed that Mary Ann was the key to his happiness, and when she rejected him, it triggered his need for control. To him, she wasn't just a woman, she was an object of his desire, something he could possess, someone he could make understand his feelings. The forensic psychologist's analysis shed light on why Thompson had resorted to violence when his emotional needs were unmet. His desire to control Mary Ann, to make her see him as the center of her world, had driven him to extremes. But it was clear that this wasn't just about Mary Ann, this was about Thompson's deeper need for validation and power. He's always been someone who needed to be in control, Dr. Michaels continued. His entire life in Brooksville was about creating an image of someone dependable, trustworthy, and in control. But when Mary Ann rejected him, his world unraveled and he lost that control. The murder was his way of regaining it. As Harris continued her investigation into Thompson's motives, the town of Brooksville began to face the reality of what had happened. The community was still reeling from the shock of Thompson's arrest, but now there were other questions that no one had dared to ask before. Had they all been blind to the signs? Had they missed the warning signs of Thompson's behavior, his manipulations, and his growing obsession with Mary Ann? The people of Brooksville struggled to reconcile the image they had of Thompson with the truth of his actions. Neighbors, friends, and even former colleagues began to question their interactions with him, wondering if they had missed something in his behavior that could have warned them of the danger he posed. Evelyn Porter, Mary Ann's mother, was no exception. She had trusted James Thompson, and now she was left to wrestle with the painful reality that she had been deceived. In the weeks following the arrest, Evelyn's grief turned into anger. She had lost her daughter, but now she had to face the betrayal of a man she had once called a friend. As she sat in her living room, staring at a photograph of Mary Ann, Evelyn whispered, "How could I have not seen it? How could I have let him so close to her?" In an effort to understand Thompson better, Harris delved further into his past, uncovering even more disturbing details. She learned that Thompson had struggled with relationships throughout his life. He had been married once before, but the marriage ended abruptly when his wife left him, citing his possessive and controlling nature as the reason for the separation. Thompson's history of failed relationships, combined with his obsessive tendencies, painted a clear picture of a man who had never learned to deal with rejection in a healthy way. Instead, he had turned inward, developing an unhealthy attachment to Mary Ann that ultimately led to tragedy. As Harris pieced together the final moments of Mary Ann's life, the one question that remained unanswered was, why Mary Ann? Thompson's obsession with her was clear, but why had he chosen her as the object of his desires? Was it her kindness, her innocence, or something else entirely? Harris didn't have the answer yet, but she knew that the deeper she dug into Thompson's mind, the closer she would come to understanding his motivations. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and manipulation, and it was Harris's job to uncover it. The town of Brooksville had never seen a trial like this. The once quiet town, known for its small-town charm and close-knit community, now found itself thrust into the spotlight. The murder of Mary Ann Porter had shattered the peaceful facade, and the trial of James Thompson was about to expose the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface for years. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. News crews from across the state were there, cameras flashing, reporters scrambling for every word. The residents of Brooksville filled the benches, eager to see justice served, but many of them were still struggling to reconcile the image of Thompson they had known with the man now sitting in the defendant's chair. James Thompson, dressed in a navy blue suit, sat silently at the defense table, his face emotionless. He had been arrested months earlier, but now, in the harsh light of the courtroom, the full weight of his actions seemed to sink in. For the first time, the public was about to hear the full extent of the crime he had committed. Across from him, Prosecutor Emily Hayes stood with unwavering confidence. She had been assigned to the case shortly after Thompson's arrest, and she knew this trial would be her most challenging case yet. The evidence was strong, but she also knew that Thompson would fight back. He had already shown how calm and calculated he could be when it came to covering up his dark deeds. Emily was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure that he faced justice. The trial began with the prosecutor's opening statement. Emily Hayes wasted no time, walking to the front of the courtroom with an air of authority. She began by addressing the jury, her voice calm but filled with determination. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, This is not just a case of murder. This is a case of manipulation, obsession, and betrayal. The defendant, James Thompson, stood in this town, blending in, earning the trust of those around him, and yet behind the friendly facade, he harbored a dangerous obsession with a young woman, Mary Ann Porter. Emily paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. The room was quiet, the only sound being the soft shuffle of papers. James Thompson murdered Mary Ann Porter because he couldn't accept her rejection. He tried to control her, to force her to see him as more than just a neighbor, more than just a friend. When she refused him, when she rejected him, he took her life in an attempt to make her his own. She motioned toward Thompson, who remained still, his eyes fixed on her as though nothing had changed. We have evidence that links Thompson to the crime scene, DNA, eyewitness accounts, and his own confession. The truth is undeniable. James Thompson killed Mary Ann Porter, and now it's time for justice. Emily turned and walked back to her seat, her eyes lingering on the jury. The room was tense, the gravity of her words hanging heavily in the air. Harris, sitting in the gallery, could feel the pressure of the moment. The trial had finally begun, and she knew it would be a long road ahead. But now there was no turning back. The truth was coming to light, piece by piece. After the prosecution's statement, it was time for the defense. James Thompson's attorney, Richard Mitchell, a seasoned lawyer with a reputation for defending high-profile cases, rose to his feet. He was an older man with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a sharp suit. He looked around the room before turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today with one simple request," Mitchell began, his voice smooth and persuasive. "I ask that you keep an open mind. The evidence presented so far has been strong, yes, but we must remember one crucial fact. James Thompson is innocent." The defense lawyer's words seemed to hang in the air for a moment. He took a slow step forward, pacing the floor as he spoke. "You have been told that James Thompson murdered Mary Ann Porter because of an obsession. But this is not the whole truth. What you haven't been told is that this is a case of mistaken identity, of a tragic accident that no one could have predicted." Mitchell's tone was calm and measured, but there was an edge to his words. He was trying to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, to sway the jury with an alternative theory. James Thompson had no reason to kill Mary Ann. Yes, he may have had a friendship with her family, but there is no evidence to support the claim that he was obsessed with her. The DNA evidence? It could have been planted. The so-called confession? A product of police pressure and coercion. Mitchell's eyes locked onto the jury, his gaze unwavering. "We believe James Thompson is innocent, and the truth will come to light as this trial progresses. You will see that he is not the killer, but the victim of a tragic and unfortunate series of events." Harris, sitting in the back of the courtroom, felt a mix of disbelief and anger as she listened to Mitchell's defense. She knew that he was doing his job, trying to save Thompson, but his arguments seemed weak, full of holes. The evidence was clear. Thompson had killed Mary Ann. There was no way around that. The prosecution's first witness was Evelyn Porter, Mary Ann's mother. The courtroom fell silent as she took the stand, her face drawn with grief and exhaustion. She had been through so much over the past months. Her daughter was gone, and now she was forced to relive the worst moment of her life. Emily Hayes approached her, speaking softly but firmly. "Mrs. Porter, could you please tell the jury about your daughter, Mary Ann? What kind of person was she?" Evelyn looked down at her hands, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mary Ann was my world," she said softly. "She was everything to me. She had so much to live for. She was kind, caring, and full of life. She was a dreamer, she wanted to be an artist. She wanted to change the world." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she kept going. "I never thought I'd have to bury my own daughter. And I never thought someone I trusted, someone I considered a friend, could do something like this." Her words were raw, filled with pain and sorrow. It was impossible not to feel the weight of her loss. The courtroom was silent as she finished her testimony, and even the defense lawyer seemed to hesitate before he spoke. "Mrs. Porter," Mitchell began, his voice soft but probing, "do you believe that James Thompson murdered your daughter because of a personal vendetta? Or could there be another explanation?" Evelyn's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of doubt. But then her voice grew steady, her resolve strengthening. "I don't know why he did it, but I know one thing for sure. James Thompson killed my daughter. I have no doubt about that." The days following the opening statements were filled with emotional testimony from the prosecution's witnesses. Each account, each recollection of Mary Ann's life and death, brought the pain of her loss closer to the surface. The trial was hard on everyone, especially Evelyn, who had to relive the worst day of her life over and over again. For Detective Harris, the trial was a bitter reminder of the case she had worked on tirelessly. The faces of the jurors, their expressions hard and unreadable, made her wonder if they truly understood the weight of the decision they were about to make. As the first week of the trial came to a close, the jury was left to process everything they had heard. The defense had painted a picture of confusion, doubt, and false accusations, but the prosecution's evidence was undeniable. The truth had been laid bare. Now it was up to the jury to decide. Would they find Thompson guilty of the brutal murder of Mary and Porter, or would they fall prey to the defense's claims of innocence? Harris could only wait as the trial continued, knowing that the hardest part, the final verdict, was still to come. The trial had reached a critical point. The courtroom, once filled with curiosity and anticipation, now pulsed with tension. Every word spoken seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the collective silence of the jury, the spectators, and the people who had come to Brooksville from surrounding towns to witness the proceedings. This wasn't just any trial, it was the trial of a man who had betrayed the trust of an entire community, and his fate would determine whether justice would truly be served. On one side, prosecutor Emily Hayes had presented her case with passion, her arguments unwavering. On the other side, defense attorney Richard Mitchell was relentless, using every tactic at his disposal to discredit the prosecution's evidence and create doubt in the minds of the jury. In the middle, the jury sat in quiet deliberation, their expressions unreadable. Every piece of evidence, every statement from the witnesses, was carefully scrutinized. Would they convict Thompson of murder, or would they be swayed by the defense's claims of an innocent man being falsely accused? After several days of testimony, Emily Hayes called her final witness to the stand, Detective Lisa Harris. Harris had been the one to crack the case, the one who had pieced together the puzzle that ultimately led to James Thompson's arrest. Her testimony would be the key to solidifying the prosecution's case. The courtroom grew silent as Harris took the stand, her heart pounding. She had been through so much in the past few months, investigating, gathering evidence, and working tirelessly to uncover the truth. Now, as she looked out at the jury, she knew that this moment could make or break the case. Emily Hayes began with a simple question. Detective Harris, can you please explain to the jury how the investigation into Mary and Porter's murder led to the arrest of James Thompson? Harris nodded, her voice steady as she began. The investigation into Mary Ann's disappearance began with the discovery of a piece of fabric near the woods where her body was found. That fabric was later linked to a jacket worn by James Thompson. We found traces of his DNA on the fabric, which placed him at the scene of the crime. We also found evidence that Thompson had been in close proximity to Mary Ann in the days leading up to her death, and that he had been at her home just before she disappeared. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. We also know that Thompson was the last person to see Mary Ann alive. His alibi was shaky at best, and his behavior during the investigation was suspicious. In his confession, he admitted to having an obsession with Mary Ann, but he also claimed that her rejection had driven him to commit murder. There was a collective intake of breath from the courtroom. Harris continued. The evidence is clear. James Thompson murdered Mary Ann Porter. He had the motive, the opportunity, and the means to commit the crime. The defense, led by Richard Mitchell, was quick to respond. Mitchell stood up from his seat, pacing slowly in front of the jury. His voice was calm and measured, and there was a subtle edge to his words as he began his cross-examination of Detective Harris. Detective Harris, Mitchell began, his eyes focused on her, you've been very thorough in your investigation, but I must ask, are you absolutely certain that the DNA found on the fabric belonged to James Thompson? Couldn't it have been contaminated or planted? Harris was prepared for this line of questioning. She had anticipated that the defense would try to discredit the evidence. Absolutely certain, she replied, her voice unwavering. The DNA was a direct match. It came from the fabric that was found near the scene of the crime, and it was tested in multiple labs. There's no question about its authenticity. Mitchell's face betrayed a hint of frustration, but he continued with his attack. And the confession? He asked, raising an eyebrow. You're aware that Thompson made his confession under extreme duress, aren't you? The police had already arrested him. He had been questioned multiple times. Isn't it possible that he was coerced into admitting to something he didn't do? Harris's expression remained calm, but inside she felt the sting of his words. It wasn't uncommon for defense lawyers to challenge the validity of confessions, but she knew Thompson's confession was legitimate. He had made the admission without any pressure, and there was no evidence to suggest it was coerced. The confession was voluntary, Harris responded firmly. Thompson didn't show signs of being coerced, and he didn't retract his statement. It was a clear and concise confession to the crime. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he shifted his strategy. "Let's talk about Mary Ann's personal life," he said, his voice lowering. "You've mentioned that Thompson had an obsession with her. But what about her relationships with other people? Couldn't it be possible that someone else had a motive for her death? Perhaps someone she was involved with? A jealous lover, maybe?" The defense was attempting to plant seeds of doubt in the jury's mind. Harris knew this was a tactic meant to divert attention away from Thompson's guilt. She couldn't allow it to work. "There's no evidence to suggest that anyone else was involved in her death," Harris replied, her tone firm. "Mary Ann was not involved in any other relationships that could have led to her murder. Thompson was the only one who had both the motive and the opportunity." As the trial continued, it became clear that the community of Brooksville was divided. Some people still held out hope that Thompson might be innocent, while others believed he was guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. At lunch breaks, groups of townspeople gathered in the courthouse lobby, talking in hushed tones about the trial. Some stood by Thompson, defending his character, insisting that there had to be some mistake. Others, including many of Mary Ann's friends, expressed their anger and disbelief that anyone could defend him after everything that had come to light. Evelyn Porter, Mary Ann's mother, had been in the courtroom every day, watching every moment of the trial with a mix of grief and determination. Her eyes were often red from crying, but there was no hesitation in her posture. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now she had to face the truth. "I want to believe that justice will be served," Evelyn told Harris during a brief moment outside the courtroom. "But it's hard. It's so hard. How do you accept the fact that someone you trusted did this to your child?" Harris had no answer. She didn't know how anyone could fully accept it. But she did know one thing: the truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it was revealed. As the trial entered its final phase, Mitchell made his last-ditch effort to create doubt in the minds of the jury. He called expert witnesses who questioned the forensic evidence, suggesting that the DNA could have been compromised during the investigation or mishandled by the police. He also continued to push the narrative that Thompson's confession might have been the result of overzealous interrogation tactics. But Emily Hayes wasn't backing down. She had seen the evidence and she knew the truth. The jury had heard it all, and now they had to decide what they believed. The final moments of the trial were tense, and as both sides made their closing arguments, Harris sat back, reflecting on everything that had happened. The case was now in the hands of the jury. All she could do was wait. The courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was palpable. The jury had been deliberating for hours, but the final decision was still to come. James Thompson sat in the defendant's chair, his face a mask of calm, though his hands were clenched tightly in his lap. He had said nothing throughout the entire trial, offering no reaction to the proceedings, no emotion as the prosecution had presented its case, and no words of defense as the jury had returned to deliberate. The judge, Judge Samuel Everett, sat behind his bench, his eyes scanning the courtroom. He had presided over countless cases, but even he could sense the gravity of this one. The entire town of Brooksville had been watching, waiting, hoping for closure. On one side of the courtroom, Evelyn Porter sat rigidly in her chair, her face pale, her hands gripping the edges of the bench. She had been through the worst moment of her life, and now, all she could do was wait. Her daughter was gone and nothing could bring her back. But for the first time in months she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, there could be some justice for Mary Ann. Her heart raced with anticipation. Every tick of the clock seemed to stretch into eternity. She kept looking at the empty chair beside her, where Mary Ann used to sit, her face filled with warmth and life. But now it was just an empty seat, a painful reminder of what she had lost. For weeks, Evelyn had lived in this limbo, the overwhelming grief of losing her daughter mingled with the anxiety of the trial. The trial had revealed the truth that James Thompson was the one who had taken Mary Ann's life. And now it was up to the jury to decide whether he would face justice. The door to the jury room opened, and the foreman of the jury stepped forward. There was a collective hush as he made his way to the judge's bench, holding a small folded piece of paper in his hand. He was followed by the other jurors, all of whom had grim expressions on their faces. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Everett asked, his voice steady and authoritative. The foreman nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he handed the paper to the judge. "We have, Your Honor." The judge unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the contents. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The jury had deliberated for days, weighed the evidence, and listened to the arguments. Now their decision would determine James Thompson's fate. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Everett instructed. James Thompson stood slowly, his face expressionless, his hands still clenched at his sides. He didn't show any sign of emotion as the foreman read aloud the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, James Thompson, guilty of the first-degree murder of Mary Ann Porter. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The room erupted into a mix of shock, relief, and emotion. Evelyn Porter closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't know whether to feel relief or sadness. Her daughter's killer had been found guilty, but Mary Ann was still gone. The justice she had longed for had come, but it was bittersweet. Thompson stood still, his face pale but unchanged. His eyes flickered toward the jury, but there was no anger, no denial. He didn't seem surprised. He had already accepted his fate. The courtroom was in chaos. Some of the spectators, who had been following the trial closely, erupted in cheers and applause. Others, like Sarah Mitchell, who had once defended Thompson, sat in stunned silence. She couldn't reconcile the man she had known with the murderer he had become. She had hoped for an acquittal, but now she was faced with the harsh reality. Evelyn Porter's heart was heavy as she stood and walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. The pain of losing her daughter was still there, but there was a sense of finality. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. The justice she had fought for had been served. After the verdict, the judge called for a brief recess before sentencing. When the court reconvened, the mood in the room had shifted. The weight of the trial had been lifted, but now it was time for Thompson to face the consequences of his actions. James Thompson, Judge Everett began, his voice solemn, "You have been found guilty of the murder of Mary Ann Porter. The jury has spoken, and the evidence against you is undeniable. You took the life of a young woman with a bright future, and you shattered the lives of those who loved her." The judge paused, his eyes briefly meeting Evelyn's. He could see the pain in her face, the deep grief that would never truly go away. No sentence could ever bring Mary Ann back, but the law had to be upheld. "You will serve life in prison without the possibility of parole," Judge Everett continued, his voice unwavering. "You have forfeited any right to a second chance. Your actions have destroyed a family, and today, you will begin to pay for the life you took." Thompson's face remained unchanged, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. He had been convicted, and now his fate was sealed. His future was spent behind bars, a man forever defined by the crime he had committed. As Thompson was led away in handcuffs, Evelyn stood frozen in place. She could hardly believe it was over. After everything she had been through, after all the grief and heartbreak, she finally felt like she could start to heal. The trial had taken so much out of her. It had forced her to relive every painful memory, every second of anguish that she had endured since Mary Ann's disappearance. But now, for the first time, she felt a glimmer of peace. Mary Ann would never return, but the man who had taken her life would pay the price. And in some small way that brought her a sense of closure. "I'll never get her back," Evelyn whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "But at least I know she didn't die in vain. At least I know he won't hurt anyone else." Her voice was soft, but it was filled with the quiet strength that had carried her through the darkest days of her life. She had waited so long for this moment, and now it was here. The road ahead would still be long. Grief never truly ends and healing takes time, but for the first time in months, Evelyn felt like she could move forward. The days after the verdict were marked by a mix of emotions. The people of Brooksville were still processing the trial, still coming to terms with the fact that someone they had trusted for so long had committed such a heinous crime. But with the verdict in place, there was a sense of closure, even if it didn't bring back what had been lost. The community began to heal, slowly but surely. The wounds left by Mary Ann's murder would never fully heal, but the town could begin to rebuild. People who had once lived in fear now began to feel safe again. The trust they had placed in James Thompson had been shattered, but they had learned a painful lesson. No one, no matter how familiar, is beyond suspicion. As the months passed, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the journey she had been through. She would never forget Mary Ann, and she would never stop missing her. But the trial had given her something she had been searching for: justice. "Mary Ann," she whispered to the photograph of her daughter that now sat on the mantel, "you didn't die in vain. Your killer will never hurt anyone again. I promise you that." And with that promise, Evelyn took the first step toward healing, knowing that her daughter's memory would live on forever, in her heart and in the hearts of everyone who loved her.